Thanks a lot, Keith, and I want to thank you all for inviting me. I've been wonderfully treated. I've had a great time here. Met a lot of people, students, old friends, former students who are down here from Yale. It's been a very fine 3 days, and I'm continuing an argument. That is, there was talk 1, there was talk 2, now there's talk 3, and it may be a little bit bewildering to somebody who comes in at Act 3 or talk 3, but I'll just do a little bit of recapping, then go on. I'm not going to repeat. I'm just going to recap a little bit. My uber question to these 3 talks is partisan balance, why doesn't the American system fly apart? I'm looking at just one aspect of the American separation of power system to try to plumb that question, having to do with the 3 elective institutions nationally, House, Senate, and presidency. And I started with a data set in which I examined the electoral bases in a particular fashion of the presidency, the House, and the Senate, and came to a conclusion, an inference that in an important respect are not all that different in the median presidential vote and the presidential vote in the House, median House constituency, the mean Senate constituency is not all that different from the major party vote share period nationally up there. Now, what might the implications of all this? Beyond that, I went to take up presidential proposals, 184 presidential domestic proposals, starting in 1949, 15 presidencies from HST in his full term, his second term, which was his only full one, through Bush 43 in his second term, looking at the first 2 years in those terms. Of those terms, 15 presidencies, the first 2 years of those terms, 184 presidential proposals, and I came out with a data set there. And one of the questions I addressed early on might be a little bit that the Democratic presidents are penalized in this legislative arena. It's very difficult to make a tractable question, but there was one way to perhaps lend some possible tractability to it. The reason for a Democratic president penalty might be that the House, on average, has been situated at its median constituency about 1.1% in the Republican direction from the national popular vote share, and the Senate about 1.3%. There's virtually no difference between the deviations in the House and the Senate, only a small difference between that deviation of either, and only a small deviation in either case from the national House presidential vote. Seemingly not. I didn't see a good, by one measurement technique and by just one way of looking at it, a Democratic presidential penalty. That was lecture 1. Lecture 2, I took up the House and the Senate, trolling for chamber asymmetry. Is there any case that one House, as opposed to the 2, when presidents have gotten in trouble on Capitol Hill and they've had their 184 proposals and they've lost 74 of them, on Capitol Hill, about 39% they lose. Is there any evidence that one of those houses has served as a distinctive outlier, either for Democratic presidents in particular, or Republican presidents in particular, or all presidents in general? And my answer was really not very much. The Senate, by a little bit. They have 23 unique kills or favoritisms. The House having 16. It's a little bit of a difference. About 4% of the presidential proposals on average give that net presidential, that net Senate disfavoritism, but it's not really very much. So the story there, and the way the 2 houses have treated proposals is not that far from the positive default of no difference at all, which we might expect to be there, might expect to be the case, given that the partisan tilt, the partisan deviation of the House from the presidency and the Senate from the presidency are virtually identical. Okay, that's a lot to go by in a hurry. If you're at the first 2 talks, maybe it will work. But then I went on to say that over the long haul, it's 60 years after all, 15 presidencies, there have certainly been procedural idiosyncrasies operative in the system that have pulled the policy reality away from the default, or at least might have. Or, for example, the Senate filibuster. That's obvious. We know about that. The old House oligarchy is often talked about back in Judge Smith days. He of the Rules Committee back in the 50s and 60s and so on. And last time I discussed 6 alleged spheres of idiosyncrasy, but I argued that these have been particular to eras, to chambers, or to policy areas, and that and in Senate versus House terms, they've tended to cancel each other out. Sometimes the House has been an outlier for some particular reason, some era. Sometimes the Senate's been an outlier for filibuster reasons, an outlier killer. But there's something of a canceling out, as well as a canceling out pattern here, as well as I say that the outlier-doms have tended to be policy area specific, or era specific, or chamber specific. Nonetheless, to go on almost to today, some of these procedural idiosyncrasies have been very serious matters. the civil rights filibuster being one, for example, but not the only one. Very serious matters. And it's not surprising that the public and political science, through its manifold theorizing and data collection over the last 60 years, has spent a great deal of time dwelling on and wrestling with these various procedural idiosyncrasies I've talked about. Now, today I want to present one last line of argument in this, one last piece of argument, let's say, in this general argument over the three talks, and it is this, and I'll slow down a little bit now I've gotten into dealing with the day's subject. It's this, that I want to make a case that, maybe this is obvious, but it hasn't been made exactly, I think, that procedural reform, or the drive to achieve it, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but procedural reform efforts, serious ones, with a lot of energy, mobilization, enthusiasm, intensity behind them, have been endogenous to the American system. As an endogenous, they belong very high on the list of endogenous features of the American system, or procedural reform does, or procedural reform drive does, procedural reform drives do. It's to go on a little bit making this argument, for many purposes, we shouldn't see rules and institutions as fixed. We shouldn't model them as fixed. The Constitution has to be modeled in some respects as a fixed set of institutions or procedures. That's true. But even there, the Constitution could be kicked over, as in the case of the 17th Amendment in 1913 when it was ratified. It isn't much. It hasn't been changed much. And some of it's simply not to be amendable. Of course, it's not easily amendable. Actually, in the paper this morning, it looks like one amendment might happen. Constitutional amendment, one to take away from governors the power to appoint senators. Looks like with another year, maybe governors, it'll be all up for governors on that front. Looks as if that may happen. It's interesting. I think it may go through the Congress and the state legislatures. It could be a popular cause, but still. So that's a small matter that's not fixed. But in general, rules and institutions, you've got to think about rules and institutions as being flexible and changeable, and as subject to treatment and amendment and targeting rather than. Such reform drive change is a good prospect if any institution is seen to be not properly representative, which means that it's seen by many, seen widely and at least halfway credibly, plausibly, to be seen to cause policy deviation from the median national voter viewpoint, seen to cause policy deviation from the median national voter viewpoint. An institution that can have that wrap put onto it, maybe targeted and maybe subject successfully to change. It's a reform, and a reform drive may come down. Now, reform drives often work in the technical sense of the ones I'm going to talk about, in that they do induce successfully formal process or institutional change. I'm going to be using the terms procedure, process, institution, more or less interchangeably here. Maybe they shouldn't be, but I don't think there's a problem doing that in this context. But change can also come about. That is to say, reform drives can be successful formally. They can be just about as successful or significantly successful in another sense. That is, even if reform drives don't actually bring about formal change, they can threaten it, and by threaten it, they can induce sometimes policy change. They can lever change. They can lever policy change or electoral change of an important sort through the threat of procedural change, even if procedural change doesn't eventually come down. That can happen too. So the success, in a sense, can be of two kinds here. In the long run, I think that if all this is true, we ought to expect a pattern of homeostasis. That is to say, as the national institution, they are complicated. They're so complicated, given the Constitution, that they can take on barnacles, in effect. Very complicated. And over time, there's a matter of barnacles appear, and over time they are excised. Probably that's through reform drive, something like that. Over time, there ought to be a homeostatic tilt back toward non-deviation through the realm of processes from the median voter. And the default I talked about in the first lecture ought to be there. That House, Senate, and presidency shouldn't be that far apart in their policy propensities, given all this. That is to say, well, the deviations by particular institutions can be tamed back toward representational conventionality, put it that way. It's probably a never-ending process. Those problems do pop up. They're treated. People get exercised. They go out. They try to do something about it. It's hard to envision a universe in which this kind of propensity comes to an end. It's there. Probably it will go on. That is to say, as Herbstein used to say, if what does he used to say? If something is interminable, it will not come to an end. That is, it will come, something like that. I've forgotten what it was. It was a nice elocution. In the long run, there's a bent toward corrigibility, in short. As, for example, with the 17th Amendment. I think the 17th Amendment involving the Senate of the late 19th, early 20th centuries is a classic instance of an alleged deviation by a major institution from the position policy-wise of the national median voter. Pressure built up. An event happened. Actually, an event seemed to have triggered the 17th Amendment in 1910, 11, 12, 13. It came down, and the Senate probably was gravitated back toward the representational conventionality as well as toward the popular election by the reform process in 10 through 1913. All right, since World War II, I see this is the time frame during which I've been collecting and mobilizing data. I see at least 6. I'm going to talk about 6 corrective reform enterprises of this sort. In each case, 4 of them have targeted Congress, let's say. 4 of them have targeted Congress in one fashion or another. Sometimes the state legislatures do. 2 of them have targeted the presidency. And I want to get those under the rope here or into the tent because the presidency can be seen also, credibly seen, as a deviating outlier institution policy-wise. It can be, and for procedural reasons. It's there. It's not just the Congress or each of the houses of the Congress that could be thus impeached or impugned. The presidency, too. Note that I think targeting in a reform drive is especially likely and may take on a special intensity in the circumstance where a process or an institution is seen not only as deviating in the fashion I'm talking about it, but is also seen as too powerful. And as you multiply alleged powerfulness or increasing powerfulness by alleged deviation, and you've got a particularly potent formula, I think, for a reform drive. All right, briefly, I want to discuss 6 of these, and then go on to some non-reform drives of recent times and discuss why they might not be non-reform drive. I have an outline to this lecture up there flashed on the back, and I managed to get the whole page onto the board. So there it is. I don't have to move back and push the thing down, and I also don't have any charts today otherwise, so you could spend time, if you wish, just staring at that chart. It is an outline. It is an outline to a brief, a sketchy outline to the whole lecture. All right, briefly, 6 reform drives. From the Democratic or liberal side, we've had 4 such instances, I think, or 4 that I want to talk about. They are the 4. The first of them is the drive to bring about the redistricting revolution of the 1960s. Very important. It was there. It's a classic reform drive. It was a long march through the courts, at least partly by lawyers. Lawyers took an interest. Journalists, academics took an interest. Sometimes academics are major participants in reform drive. They do scholarship, which helps along reform. In this case, there was important scholarship, for example, by the political scientists Robert Dixon and Robert McKay back in probably the 50s that helped along this reform drive, that its unfairness was pointed out. There was journalists, academics, and lawyers, I'd say, were the big actors on the front to do this. They started in the 40s, I think, going to the courts, making a case that the state legislatures, by implication possibly also the U.S. House, were in bad shape because the rural areas are overrepresented. There were vast disparities, as you know, probably back in the decades before the mid-60s in the sizes of populations in the state assemblies, the state senates, and the U.S. House. Nobody ever touched on this in any move like this, the U.S. Senate. It's still there the way it was. But all the other legislatures of the states and the U.S. House were touched, were aimed at, were targeted, touched, and made over by the redistricting reform drive of the 50s and 60s. The legislatures were, in effect, de-ruralized. Effectively, there's a reform drive that succeeded. You could tie a ribbon around it with the Supreme Court cases. It's formal success in the 1960s, and the consequences probably have been considerable. I made a case yesterday, as Steve Van Silverberg and people have done in a recent book, for probably the policy consequences of the equalization of the districts in my case, the House of Representatives. They talk about the state legislatures. That's instance number 1. It's easy enough. I mean, it's a stylized, classic instance of a successful reform drive aiming, probably in the minds of the practitioners, to push the policy point back toward the national median voter. The reformers seeing it as being being deviated too much toward rurals going into the campaign. A second reform drive. This is less well known, but I think it's important. It's this. It's the drive in the Senate, with support outside from journalists, and a fair amount of contention to it. I remember this drive of the 1950s and 60s to curb the Senate filibuster. The 50s, a particular drive in the 1950s and 60s to curb the Senate filibuster. In 1946, for the first time, a president, first time in the 20th century, a president proposed seriously civil rights legislation and sent it to the Hill. After World War II, the civil rights became a very serious matter on Capitol Hill, and I would say probably it wasn't a very serious matter before that in legislative drives or occasional instances, but after World War II, it's there on the agenda. The Senate is, of course, kicked up. Filibusters occurred, threatened filibusters occurred, bills were not passed, they were modified. And senators under the leadership of Clinton Anderson of New Mexico, a Democrat, started in the mid-50s a drive to change the rules of the Senate so as to allow the Senate on the opening day of the Senate to, if they wanted to establish rules that allow simply majority rule in the Senate, period. Now, this was seen, it was a matter of trying this every 2 years and getting more votes each time, or at least many times, as they went from one January of an odd year to January of an odd year next time. They started with 21 votes in the Senate. They built it up to votes in the mid-40s. The Senate then had 48 members. And the calculation on that one, for political watchers, of whom I was one at the time, and probably Fred Greenstein was too, was that if they managed to make it to the 48 mark, or the 49 mark, then maybe that would be it. Maybe the Senate filibuster would be bowled over somehow. You probably couldn't thwart the majority of the Senate on an opening day who wanted to do something that's led by Clinton Anderson. That was a very plausible political calculation by watchers and by politicians. And a kind of steam built up. And the threat of putting this across was there in the 1950s and the first half of the 1960s as the Congress considered a succession of civil rights bills. And it was widely thought in the Senate that if they didn't pass, at least in modified form, some of these bills, as in 1957, or in magnificent form in 1964 and 65, then the rules would be changed, a la Clinton Anderson. Now, as it happens, the rules did not get changed, consequentially in an important way. But they didn't get changed, at least because policy concessions warded them off. As Lyndon Johnson, as head of the Senate, was just ahead of Clinton Anderson, as it happened. That is, he would concede just enough to keep the rules in place and pass enough of the civil rights bill to keep the Senate operating the way it was. So here, formally, this is a reform drive that failed. That is, the rules did not change. But in the sense that a reform drive can lever policy change, it did succeed, I think. There it was. It probably helped lever the civil rights enactments of the 1950s and 1960s. That's number two. Number three is probably the best known of all reform drives that are relevant to what I'm talking about during the last 60 years. It's been written about by Julian Zelizer. It's been written about by Nelson Polsby. It's been written about by David Rhodey, for example, to name three. A great deal of talent and political science analysis has gone into this, and this is the effort to reform the House, after all, in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. Reform the House. Nothing is more classic as a reform drive. Probably there's probably been more words devoted to this one than anything else I'm talking about here, which is an indicator of the complexity and the importance of it, I think. Even more probably words devoted, if you take out the lawyers, than to the reapportionment, the redistricting drive of the 1950s and 60s. Lawyers have a lot of words. It's some nodes in this. The effort was to reform the committee and seniority system of the House, in particular the Rules Committee, but not just that. There were a lot of committee barons. They seemed to be Southerners. They seemed to be certainly off Democratic National Party median, to end what was seen to be oligarchic control of the House, oligarchic control of the U.S. House of Representatives by Dixie Democrats, from the Dixie conservative Democrats. That's put simply, probably the two most important nodes of change in the reform drive came in 1961, after Kennedy was elected, when the House Democrats, by a narrow margin in cooperation with some Republicans, brought about a packing of the Rules Committee, changing its membership size and making it amenable, the Rules Committee, which has been ever since, to leadership cores of the House Democratic and sometimes Republican Party since then, a very important node. The other came in 1974, when the Democratic caucus deprived 3 or 4, I think it was 4, House members, committee barons of their chairmanships by vote in the caucus. This is a heroic day in the history of House reform, whatever it was, or week in the history of House reform in 1974. There are other no's. Those are probably the big ones. This is well-known territory, but it's complicated, I think. It's complicated. It's an interesting question. As a theoretical matter, what were those liberals up to as they were doing that, trying to reform the House? What were they up to? And there are at least two answers. I think one answer is that they're trying to empower House floor majorities over whom they seem to be saw to be as obstructive committee barons, representing a minority of the whole House, who were thwarting the whole floor majorities from doing what they wanted. See, that's simple enough. It was a target. They were targeting, in effect, what they saw as the anti-majoritarian committee baron feature of the House. So, in that sense, this is the reform effort is a majoritarian and intra-House majoritarian reform effort. That's part of it. I mean, they had Judge Smith in their sights, and there are other instances they could refer to. Could they think of? I do think, as I argued last time, that in a sense this was a miscast. If this is theoretically what they were up to, it was in some sense a misaim. It's in the sense that I really don't think after 1940 or 80 so there's much evidence for the fact that committee barons or the seniority system or processes were in fact thwarting floor majorities in the House. Nonetheless, there was a perception that that was happening, and in some instances possibly it was happening at the margin. Possibly oligarchy was of some importance, so they wanted to get rid of it. They wanted to trash Judge Smith and the rest of the barons. All right, that's one theoretical aim. However, a second theoretical aim, which comes out in this reform drive, it seems to me, was this. They wanted to empower the House Democratic Caucus. Empower the House Democratic Caucus. Now, that's a rather different aim. And if you look at it, you look it squarely in the eye, what they were trying to do was to establish a different anti-majoritarianism in the House. That is to say, they wanted to set up the House Democratic Caucus and give it the right to establish party positions. The Democrats were the House Democratic Party then, and seemed to be the position always to be that. What they wanted was the median position, or the leading position, the dominant position in the House Democratic Caucus to be makeable to be the position of the median House member. How do you do that? Well, to do that, you might have to coerce or force all those reluctant Alabamians to vote your way. That is, to get House members to do what they otherwise would not want to do, or their constituencies would not want them to do. That is to say, there's a sense in which they were trying to trade in which they saw as one kind of anti-majoritarianism in the House, Judge Smith's, to another kind of anti-majoritarianism in the House. That is, party caucus rule of a force somehow through the use of whatever that could establish small majorities that otherwise naturally wouldn't be there, even in a Democratic Party control. Now, this is a very different kind of thing. I think that reform is a mix of these two aims, which adds a kind of confusion to it. And you read some of these people like Dick Bowley, who is writing books, and which I've done, and it's not easy to see what he was up to, arguing theoretically and arguing for reform. By the way, recently, along this line of establishing the party caucus as the dominant feature in the system, even though over the objections possibly of people who might have to make up a House floor majority, making a party that strong. There's a kind of whiff of Leninism in this. And over the weekend, I went back and took a look at just interestingly, because I thought it might be analogously, make an analysis argument. The old APSA report of 1950 taught a more responsible two-party system, I recommend going back and taking a look at it. It's a very smart book. You probably have heard of it. But exactly what they're arguing is of some interest in that report. And let me tell you what I found. In that report, which is fairly long, I could not find any interest in the idea of majority rule by the American public, or any interest in the idea of majoritarianism in the House. What they're interested in is establishing an environment in which party leaders can cohere programs together and then put them across, and then be accountable for them. That's part of the argument, too, in elections and such. But there's no talk of majority rule by the public or majority rule in the House. It's quite interesting. Now, you could say, and I think this is a quite makeable argument, that what the liberals back then in the APSA report and in the House reform effort internally, insofar as they were trying to establish the Democratic caucus as being sovereign in the House, they were aiming toward a larger systemic majoritarianism, that is, for the whole country. That is to say, one thing they probably were trying to do, even they weren't specific on the point, was to supply some kind of process arrangement that would overcome the pre-1960s district revolution rural bias in the House. So in a larger sense of serving the majority in the country, even though they didn't use those terms, you see, they could be bucking for majoritarian and Democratic Party caucus control in the House, which would match the median voter nationally, but not be able to make it with a House floor majority. That's entirely possible. But all this is there's a kind of fuzziness in what they're up to that seems to incorporate all these kinds in various mixes of aspirations. Nonetheless, the reform drive is there. It's been written about. There it is. The fourth reform drive, I'm still talking about liberals here. Democrats and liberals can be dealt with very quickly. We all know what it is. It's a presidential nominating reform in 1968. Now, again, this is a targeting of the presidency, not of the Congress. But what is it? Here again, the liberals saw the presidency then, I think it's fair to say, in 1968. Lyndon Johnson, the war, the oligarchically controlled Democratic National Conventions, the bosses come and so on, all that, undemocratic. They saw nominating reform as a corrective to an off-median institution. That's what they saw. Now, whether they were correct is another matter. Whether the Johnson presidency and whatever it was doing, including on the war, was off-median nationally is another matter. But Democratic and liberal reformers made that argument, and they believed it, and went after and tried to destroy, and successfully destroyed, actually. This was procedurally effective, the pre-1968 nominating arrangements, and bring about a different order. They did. That's the Democratic liberal side. On the Republican side, the Republican conservative side, I see a couple of reform drives that have the same cast as what I've been talking about. That is to say, they were animated by a sense of unfairness, by a sense that there was unfairness toward their side through the operation of some procedures or institutions, and a procedural reform was needed to draw the country as they saw it. This is the argument, and I think there's a lot of sincerity in politics. People tend to talk themselves into things they believe. I think they believed it, talk themselves into wanting reforms that would establish a sense of fairness. There's unloaded dice in the national political arrangements. The first of these is presidential term limits, which the Congress put forth in 1947, and then this 22nd Amendment was ratified in 1951, and since then, as you know, presidents get 2 terms, and that's it. Now, this is a reform drive and a reform achievement that has not been memorialized in a lot of scholarship. In fact, virtually nothing has been written about it. It's quite interesting. In fact, it's been commented in the sparse scholarship that has been written about it, that almost nothing has been written about it. It's a fairly common comment in the sparse scholarship about the matter, which is interesting. It's a quite important reform drive and achievement. This is formally successful, after all, the 22nd Amendment, but not much talked about. Now, the proximate cause of this is easy enough for everybody to see. The Republicans had seen 4 elections of FDR, and they were facing a Truman rerunning again in 48. It's difficult to say what would happen then. They'd had enough of it. There's no more FDRs, was at least a plausible proximate reason for the Republicans bringing this on. But a more serious interpretation can be made, and perhaps there's a deeper intuition there. If there were more scholarship on the matter, perhaps we could get a sense if there any deeper intuition there. The deeper intuition would be this one. It's that they were looking at a problem of incumbency advantage in elections at the presidential level. And here, your colleague here, Chris Aiken, has done some modeling of this and come up with the interesting, basis of very simple calculations with some logic that incumbents running again in the presidency, there's a 2 and 3 shot they'll get reelected, given some premise. And in fact, that's what happens in the presidency over American history. Incumbents run again. Incumbent people run again. They get elected roughly 2/3 of the time. It's almost exact. But there's theory behind it, too. As it happens in 1947, the 2/3 hadn't been quite achieved yet. Right now, the figures are 2/3, but still the balance in all of American history was toward advantage going to incumbents running again. What the Republicans were seeing, they're sitting there in 48. They're seeing Roosevelt ran 4 times. They just couldn't get rid of him. The old man, you couldn't diselect Roosevelt. It was like Mike Tyson fighting. He didn't lose fights. Roosevelt is not likely to lose elections. And he ran, as you know, won 4 in a row. And Truman running in 48. Now, Truman did not have the pedigree of having had won a previous election, but yet there's another Democratic president up for an incumbency tryout in 1948. And might be other reasons why he's favored in that circumstance. The Republicans were saying they were seeing a policy outlier problem over time. A policy outlier problem they were smelling over time. And also, not only that, it was occurring in what they saw as an increasingly powerful office under Roosevelt and Truman. So you multiply the accelerating power of the office times the perceived deviation, the average over time, from some national medium, and they took to this. They got out their weapons and put through it's very much a party affair. The 22nd Amendment, 47. Though the states, interestingly, the states didn't have any trouble ratifying it. A lot of those states are controlled by Democrats too. Come and think of it, but they got it through in 1951. I think over time the Republicans were fearing that they just weren't getting a fair shot at the presidency. They weren't getting a fair shot at the presidency, is what they were seeing. So do something about it. The last reform drive, and the second of the Republican conservative side reform drives is this one. It's another term limits drive, and this is the legislative term limits drive of the late 80s and the early 1990s. And here, this pertained to the state legislatures as well as to the U.S. House, but it certainly did pertain to the U.S. House. The Republicans got themselves into the state of mind in which they were thinking they were not getting a fair shot at the House by the late 1880s. By 1994, as it happens, which is a little bit in the future, the Democrats would have controlled the House for 40 years in a row, which is a record since what? At least since Andrew Jackson's time, since I don't know what, probably maybe in the early 19th century you could find some tie to this. But in any time in memory or any time in the generations going back 5 or 6 or 7, you couldn't find anything like this 40-year Democratic stranglehold on the House. Now, maybe they were right, the Republicans, that they were not getting a fair shot at the House. There is an argument there, which comes out of writing by Ann Solibert and I guess Fiorita and somebody about, I think maybe the third author, about those 40 years, which take this form. This is contestable information. Some people might have seen other scholarship, but still, it's an interesting argument. It's that. What happened was, one thing that was happening was that in the 1960s, the importance of incumbency advantage in House elections shot up. That is to say, whereas in previous times it had been worth about 2% to be an incumbent, there was a mushroom, and by the end of the 60s, it was worth 6 or 7% to be an incumbent in House elections. Well, most of those incumbents were Democrats. The bulk of those incumbents were Democrats. So the per capita favor that came to attach to House members as a consequence this very serious change in the House election arithmetic was a benefit on balance to Democrats. Also, it seemed to be that the fact of incumbency advantage pervading across the House, maybe it was true anyway, maybe it was true that it took the steam out of Republican efforts or desires to run national campaigns to try to take over the House. And they more or less gave up running nationalized campaigns to run the House there for quite a while. It's the estimate of Ann Solibert and his people, this article published some years ago, that if this is a complicated statement, but this is the way they framed it, if after the 1960s, the transformation ratio of changes in the House popular vote, the changes in seats that had obtained in the previous couple of decades, had continued to obtain in the decades after the mid-1960s, then it's likely the Republicans would have taken over the House sometimes between the mid-1960s and 1990. They estimate 3 times using their 1966, 1968, 1980, and even possibly 1988, 1990, they say. Now, yes, during those many decades, the country was basically Democratic. So just by party identification advantage alone, you would expect that Democrats would most of the time control the House. But the argument here is that there's a kind of sandbag on the safety valve, that the Republicans are simply blacked out of ever controlling the House during these through the idiosyncrasy of this coming about, probably anyway, of incumbency advantage shoot up in the middle 60s. What the Republicans saw by the late 80s was an increasingly entrenched as well as powerful Democratic oligarchy in the House of Representatives. Increasingly and powerful. The House was becoming more powerful, they saw, or thought they saw. Partly because the House control stayed longer than anything else. As presidents come and go, the senators come and go. In fact, Senate control came and went. But by the 80s, the House had a stack up of people who seemed to be there forever, wired into the bureaucracy, making for a very powerful, it was alleged, oligarchy. So attack it. one of the ingredients of the Republican attack on the Democratic House was the term limits argument. There's logic there. If just we could bring in term limits, we could break all this. Also, they could use term limits as an argument out in the public. They used it also in California against the California Assembly to try to shake up the politics. They did. And they used it pretty successfully. Now, the term limits did not successfully come about formally for the U.S. House of Representatives, though, as you know, it did so in some of the states, including California, though it probably had a political importance. That is, it became an ingredient in the reform drive that Newt Gingrich led in the late 80s, the early 1990s, which eventuated in the Republican takeover of the House in 1994, which seemed to take the steam out of this kind of argument. And since 1994, we've had very little interest in term limits being slapped onto institutions. But before that, it was a major drive. There's an interesting analogy, I think, by the way, between Newt Gingrich, as House reformer around 1990, and Dick Bowling, back in the Democratic liberal reformer back in the 50s and 60s. The argument of these are probably the emblematic reform drivers at these two junctures in American history. And in both cases, they thought that an existing House establishment had to be destroyed in order to usher in better days. In the first case, it was the Judge Smith kind of establishment. In the second case, it was the Jim Wright kind of establishment, which seemed to be going on forever. All right, now, those are my 6 reform drives that in some sense or other had some, formally or through exercising of leverage on policy, did have some significant effects. Now, I want to go on. I want to say that since the mid-1990s, there's a pause here. I finished with the 6 reform drives. We haven't seen much like this since the mid-1990s. In fact, the last decade and a third or something, I think in all of American history has been something, a period of calm on this front of reform drives having to do with representational matters. Now, there are reforms going on maybe in other sectors for other purposes, but representational matters. It is true that certain national institutions are seen to have significant problems these days, having representational problems. I'm not going to talk about the power of the presidency and all that, the war powers and such. I'm just leaving it out of the discussion. But there are at least 3 national institutions or processes that seem to have representational problems that people talk about a lot in the last decade or so. But in all these cases, the reform impulse seems to be weak. Not much is going on, not much steam, not much energy. And I think that one reason for that in all these 3 cases is that serious party imbalance is not at stake in these matters. Serious party imbalance is not at stake in these matters. Other things may be wrong, but serious imbalance between the parties. The idea is one party feels itself seriously disfavored, it will do something. Parties are one ideological cause that fairly strongly attaches to a party. Sometimes there's a little bit of a wedge between the one of those things and the other of those things, but they're fairly close in identity and in essence. But take away that kind of disparity in alleged or perceived favor, then maybe nothing will happen. The 3 I want to talk about are these. These are perceived national processes having to do with representation that some people say have a lot of problems. Some people do, but still there's not much steam behind reform drives. The first one is electoral college reform. Virtually nothing is going on having to do with reform. Now, in 2000, as you know, the popular vote went one way and the electoral vote the other and so forth. And briefly after that, there was a little bit of a flurry of interest in the electoral college. There's more of a bit of a flurry of interest in Florida. And in processes, that is, who can cast the ballot and such, seemed to take the oxygen out of anything having to do with the electoral college as a problem after the 2000 election. But that's not but I gave you a chart 2 days ago which made the case that over the last 60 years, take the 15 elections, there are now 16 elections, including the McCain election of 2008. There doesn't seem to be any party advantage, any party tip in the electoral college universe. There's no perceivable party advantage in that. 8 times in those 16 elections, the Democrats have maybe had a little bit of favoritism through the electoral college statistically. About 8 times the Republicans have had 8 times a little bit of favoritism. And With that, I think it's very difficult to steam up the party people, to steam up the liberals, to steam up the conservative. You don't see the National Review talking about this. You don't see the Nation magazine talking about this. I challenge you to go out and find the sheaf of op-eds in the last year having to do with reforming the Electoral College. I would guess it's almost nothing. The Democratic guns are silent. Now, look, there could be a lot of other reasons for getting rid of the Electoral College. That's not an issue. What is an issue for me is whether, in its current incarnation, as it exists in American life, it favors one party as opposed to the other, and it seems not to. I don't see much. I think if it did come to favor one party or the other, then we probably would see considerable steam among, and it could have come to favor one party well, it's perhaps sometimes in American history it has, but not during these 60 years. A second sphere where there is worry about representational difficulties is this one: congressional earmarks and pork. And we all know about that. McCain talked about a lot. It's not new in American life, after all. I'm just reading a book about the 1876 election, big issue in 1876, congressional pork all night. I just won't go away. But in a sense, it's a representational problem in that if you've got single-member districts in a House and a Senate, then you've got people carving up policies so they fit the districts rather than matching the generality of the country. It's a kind of dissonance that's built into a system like ours, given the representational arrangements, and people get mad about it and they worry about it and such. But right now, there isn't any party imbalance, of course. It's they all do it, or it's seen that they all do it, and indeed they do all. They all seem to do it, some more than others. If you get Steamtown with Joe McDade, and you get the Bridge to Nowhere with Stevens, and you get Bobby Byrd way down West Virginia and such. A little bit of disparity there, but it's not a party-centered disparity. They all seem to do. It seemed to be a problem, but it's not a party imbalance problem, and it's not seen to be a party imbalance problem. It's true that the minority party in the Congress, by the way, is cut into deals pretty well. That seems to be the case. You look at these highway programs. Even when one party makes up the bill in the House and make up the bill in the Senate, it's not the custom just plain to shut out. Sometimes they disfavor a little bit, but they just don't shut out the minority. But even that aside, in the long run, the medium term, over a 20-year period, a party can figure that even if they're getting a little bit disfavored now, which won't be much in the pork arena, tit for tat, perceived tit for tat over time as one party or the other takes over the House or takes over the Senate is likely to limit somewhat any such disfavoritism. And anyway, they will take over eventually. So there's just not there. For that matter, there's not much of a representational problem of another sort, I think, in the pork earmarking arena. It's this. This is not directly on my slate. It's something to discuss, but I've noticed it. Sometimes the pork problem or the earmark problem is seen to be a small state problem as opposed to a big population state problem. That is to say, we can make up statistics, we've read them, that per capita, the citizens, the residents of Wyoming get a little more federal money than do the residents of California. And there are learned treatises on this, and they're good ones. It's something that's measurable. It's been measured. But this doesn't see, yes, Wyoming does better per capita than does California or Florida in federal money give out. But I don't think this is very important. There's good work by Lee and Oppenheimer on this, an ICE book. And here's one thing that they say. It's just that if you take a small state like Wyoming, population-wise, there are not many recipients. On the other hand, you take a big state like California and New York, there are a lot of donors. So 69 to 1 is the population disparity between California and Wyoming. So the donors don't notice it. And in fact, Lee and Oppenheimer's calculation is that Californians during the time period, maybe this is an annual figure, I think, they had back about a decade in their book, Californians would have received about $10 a year more per capita. That's all, $10 a year more capita, if federal benefits were delivered on an equal per capita basis around the country. You're not going to start a revolution or reduce the constitutional convention over losing $10 per capita. It's not going to happen. So it's not a surprise that you don't see rioting in the streets of San Francisco about this disparity that it might obtain on this front. The third arena, the third problem, representational problem out there, which makes the Senate an outlier often, is the Senate cloture filibuster problem, alleged problem. And here I want to talk about it as the filibuster cloture situation of the last 20 years. I want to talk about it as the Clinton-Bush era filibuster. I mean, I made an argument last time that there's something particular about the last 20 years which has erected this 60 as a major, almost automatic bar to getting stuff through the Senate, and it wasn't that, largely before 1989 or so. I made that argument last time. But since 1989, the presidents, we've had a fair amount of filibuster blockade. But why, there isn't much steam behind trying to get rid of or change significantly this curious Senate custom. Right now, I think there are several reasons for sometimes you get some steam, as in 2000, whenever it was, 405 over judges. I mentioned this last time. The Republicans got very exercised and threatened to overturn the system, at least on appointments matters, and came within a couple of votes of doing that. But there were policy concessions, and then people receded. We haven't heard about that matter pretty much since whenever it was, 2004 or 5, whenever it was. I think there's several reasons why we don't hear more about reforming the filibuster, and here they are. One of them is that presidents' budgets are protected. I think this is a basic fact about national policy making, that presidents, for their budgets, they don't need 60 votes, they need 50 or 51. I think it's likely that if presidents' budgets were threatened by the 60 bar, then the rules were changed to accommodate the budgets. But the presidents just wouldn't allow it. The system would not accommodate. Well, actually, California does, but it's tough. California does, but you got to you got to do it by by referendum out there. It's a very tough state. But I have a feeling that budgets are not. The system does not afflict budgets. It also, for the most part, does not afflict trade agreements. There's trade agreements that are forged by presidents as a consequence of fast-track procedures, which are not always in effect, to be sure. Have traffic priority in the Senate. They can't be talked to death. But most importantly, the budgets are protected against filibustering, against having to have the 60 votes to get them through. Then there's the very common phenomenon that as happened with the judges in the middle part of this decade, that the senators, in order to keep their practices in line of being able to block things, they concede just enough in policy terms when something comes along to avert getting the rules changed. That's what happened with the Gang of 14 went to work in the middle of this decade. And that's fairly common. In fact, it's a trope in civil rights history in the 50s and 60s. Policy concessions that are important enough to ward off threats to the supermajority quality of the Senate, which, after all, many of the senators like. I think another reason, though, why probably we're not seeing significant pressure on the supermajority front is that there is not significant party imbalance. It's party imbalance or party disfavoritism in this realm since 1990. Both Clinton and the Bushes have gotten hit. Both Clinton and the Bushes have put their budgets through okay, as long as they have majorities in both houses. That was a problem for Clinton, actually, in 93, but he finally got the majorities. But otherwise, the presidents have been hit on middle range matters. Fairly importantly, there's Clinton with a stimulus bill, mentioned last time, campaign finance reform, twice, lobbying reform. The Bushes, Bush the father lost the capital gains tax cut in 1989, very heavy breathing kind of activity involving filibuster tactics in the Senate. George Mitchell wouldn't let him have it. And Bush the son, repealing the estate tax during his second term, first couple of years of his second term, Alaska drilling, medical malpractice. These are all instruments that were passed by the House, that had majority of support in the Senate, but were killed because of all these ones I just mentioned, because of the supermajoritarian processes. So I think it's probably apparent to everybody, or most actors, that A, the presidents can protect their budgets, either party, and B, that the party presidents of the two parties are about equally afflicted at the middle range by these processes. There's not a favoritism there. My guess is that the 60 process could be killed off in a hurry if one party came to see itself as uniquely disfavored in its central policy drive, uniquely disfavored in its central policy drive. I would guess that they would do something. They would call a halt. The procedures could be changed pretty quickly if a 50 plus the vice president wanted to do it. You can imagine a circumstance in which they might want to do it. For example, here's a counter scenario. 1993-94, imagine this circumstance. The Democrats, they were trying to press their health care reform, and instead of whatever it was, 35% of the public approving it, suppose 60% of the public approved it, which gives more public support for it. Suppose it gets through the House, it gets to the Senate. And it's got most senators behind it, but still there are 42 Republicans who won't back it. Again, this is not very likely because something that popular probably wouldn't get the 42 Republicans ready to stand there and block it, but just suppose for a minute that would happen. I could imagine on something that important, the Democrats with Al Gore in the chair in 1993, just making up rules on the spot to put through what they wanted to put through. And the vice president ruling, the filibuster is unconstitutional. There it is. And 51 people will go along with it, and that might be it. It could be that simple. Could be that simple. It could be that simple. It could be that simple on the spot, possibly. But we're not. It still there's a lot operating against it. I mean, party balance, as well as a policy concession, as well as the protection of the budgets. It's all another thing might be operating is this, that a minority party in the Senate, and this picks up possibly what I just said about the Republicans not filibustering that circumstance in 1993. The minority party leadership in the Senate, if it has any Downsian sense at all, will not do the kinds of things which precluded from taking over the Senate by appealing to the national electorate sufficiently to take over the Senate. This is kind of stupidity in just sitting there and voting the tastes of the kind of stupidity to it. And sometimes parties do avoid stupidity. That is the end of the story I've been telling in the last 3 days. Now, let me admit, as I did at the start, there are lots of reasons why the American separation of power system might be unappealing to people. There are reasons why it might be appealing, too. There are good arguments out there. But I've engaged here in just one line of analysis of the separation of powers system having to do with the electoral basis of these three elective institutions, and with presidential proposals domestic over the 15 Congresses. And the conclusion of it all is here, that over the long haul, the 15 representational symmetry in a partisan sense has largely prevailed. That has to do with the electoral basis. Yes, there have been significant spheres of idiosyncrasy, the filibuster, Judge Smith and all that. Yet great energy has gone into addressing idiosyncrasies. That such corrective reform and reform drives is endogenous to the system. There's probably an allowable bent there toward kicking the political reality back toward representational fairness. And I think probably as a result of all this, one likely result of all this, there's virtually no public support these days in the USA for overhauling the Constitution. Probably saving the polar bear has a lot more interest than reforming the American Constitution. And there could be the other reasons, to be sure, for changing the American Constitution. The books are written about it, saying we got to junk this, get something else, parliamentary system is better, and so forth. We've read those books. Woodrow Wilson wrote one, something like that. He wasn't actually going to junk the Constitution, but he certainly wanted to revise it. This book in 1885 revised the customs operating in it. But whatever, the public support doesn't seem to be out there. Some academics make an argument about changing significantly the Constitution, but whatever may seem to lack legitimacy in the U.S. today, and probably a lot does, particularly the financial system, the way the government's handled it. There's a lot of perception of illegitimacy out there. You can see it in the polls. The system of representation, as it adheres in this ensemble of institutions, is not on the list of something inducing illegitimacy, I think. That's it. All right.
So we have time for questions again, and today we have no mics, so just stick your hand up.
No mic?
No mics for them.
No
mic for you.
Okay.
But as I
mentioned, asymmetry.
I wore a tie for this special occasion, and as a consequence, I think that entitles me to ask the first question.
Go ahead.
So I'm going to. So I wanted to push you a little bit, though, on your list of reforms at the end. So reforms that haven't yet been successful, and you have
or even undertaken.
Right, even undertaken. You have three that you note, and so I'm a little curious as to why those three and not more. And so I'm interested in sort of what counts as in this category and what your threshold is as to sort of what makes the list and what doesn't make the list. And so as you were listing these three, I was thinking of some others, and they come to my mind in part because they are constitutional, in part because law professors are interested in them, and I talk to them, and so I'm overly influenced. But, journalists talk about them. There are congressional hearings on them, and that seems to sort of move them up into this kind of category that you'd be interested in. So, for example, lots of interest in partisan gerrymandering now and trying to adopt reforms that would somehow curb partisan gerrymandering in one fashion or another and prevent that from happening. movement to give further representation to the District of Columbia in Congress, which would be relatively minor in terms of its influence on the big scheme of things, but seems to sort of fit this kind of category. In the 80s, lots of interest in a line item veto and balanced budget amendments, which is a procedural reform, but not necessarily representational, so maybe it falls out for that kind of consideration. And fourth, now there's a lot of push to impose some kind of term limits on federal judges, so you constrain how long federal judges can hold office, which a lot of people are pushing Congress to do now, so that Obama can pack the bench.
Yeah.
May or may not go anywhere. So why don't any of these fall within your category of things that may or may not have picked up adequate steam that we ought to be thinking about?
Well, maybe they could. Actually, I think gerrymandering might. I think there that I guess my take on that would be that on gerrymandering is that it's been going on for 200 years and they all do it, and on balance it doesn't favor one party more than the other. So it's not worth working up a lot of steam to do something about. At least in the U.S. House, that's true. Now, you get into a state legislature, one party can get more disfavored because it's just one majority doing the district thing. But at the U.S. House, there'll be a kind of a cancel-out effect. So it doesn't seem to be vastly important. Even in this decade, when the Republicans did have a little bit of an advantage, maybe it was about a 6-seat advantage they got through the various state districting that was done with the U.S. House districts in the early part of this decade, it's really not very much. And as the decade went on, it went away. That is, that you just can't look at the U.S. House and see that it's a terribly important kind of thing going on. Now, the state legislatures you can, to be sure, and there it is, and it's a good question. But nationally, I think there's a kind of cancel out. It's just not very important, and that's why it doesn't take off. In the case of the D.C. vote, well, now that's a representational thing, and I don't know what to say. I don't really have anything to say about it. I do think that if they wanted to, you know how this is probably, I think there's a stalemate there. I think a constitutional amendment to give D.C. a house seat could be done. That is a constitutional amendment. Put it through the Congress and put it through the states. I think that could be done. However, putting through a constitutional amendment giving D.C. 2 senators as well as a House, that can't be done. The politics is not there. So there's a kind of stalemate. The Democrats want it all, and the Republicans would go with just the former, but are willing to do nothing. But now, as you see this curious deal they're putting through wherein Utah gets 1 seat in the House and D.C. gets 1 by statute, which is probably unconstitutional. I don't really have anything more to say about this. I think, for one thing, it's a small matter. I think that at least not for some people, but generally speaking to the American public, it's a small matter. It's not a small matter for D.C. I think line item is not enough of a representational thing to dwell on here, and I think also judges, just as elective judges doesn't have the salience to the public as a matter or as a problem to arise much in the way of steam. As you were talking, it occurred to me another candidate for the list might be campaign finance reform. Now there, I think maybe I could work this into my argument. The case to go something like this, that over a long period of time, generally speaking, the Democrats and the liberals had less money. So at least for that reason, as well as for reasons of ideology, the steam for campaign finance reform came from the left. I mean, partly it's a matter of Democrats having left money, which they did for a century or a century and a half, something like that. And progressive reformers jumped on and were on the wagon also. And when Democrats got a chance, they would put through campaign finance reform bill in 1974, particularly in 1974, which would help along their cause, But it put a lid on the people they didn't like getting, exposure and limits of various sorts. And as of a decade ago, you're seeing the same coalition as Democrats and progressive reform types, good government types like McCain, putting through the McCain-Feingold bill, and he tried for a while, and he got it through in 2000. Actually, I guess President Bush signed it in 2002. All right, now the interesting wrinkle now is the Democrats have more money in campaigns. So I haven't heard a word in recent months about campaign finance reform from anybody. It's just appeared. It's just appeared as a cause, as an interest, as a concern. It's just gone. I would suspect as long as the Democrats have more money, we're not going to be hearing about the matter. It's just not going to be there. Now, it's just not going to be there. I think more generally, probably what we're seeing in the current circumstance is a kind of equality in money. I'd be surprised if the Democrats can keep the money edge this year and the coming years that they have this year. But still, they may be enough jacked up so that on average they can have equality in money. For a century, they didn't have equality in money. They just didn't have equality in money. They had to scrimp. But now I would foresee over the next 20 years a kind of equality in money, which means I would guess the pressure for campaigning for finance reform will go way down. It may disappear. Are there even any bills in the hopper this year? How many op-eds have you seen in the Times or the Post having to do with campaign finance reform in recent months? It's just not there. It's like the Electoral College. You don't see that these days, the reforming the Electoral College either. So there's an argument there. There can be an argument on that front, and that could be incorporated. I like the gerrymander thing. I think that fits particularly well the motif of stuff not being done, causes not being pursued. I think it does. And I think probably it is, though, that at the U.S. House level, it cancels out partisan lines. Pretty much. Not completely, but pretty much. Pretty much, yeah. You call it, Peter.
I suppose we all have our list of things that were left off. But mine is the budget reform of the 70s. It seems to be, first of all, that was probably more consequential than many of the others. And consequential for a number of things. One is it allowed the Congress for the first time to look at a more general budget and not simply appropriations bills. But secondly, it also brought in reconciliation, which allowed Reagan to downsize government, which allowed Bush II to bring down taxes. It essentially allowed the packaging of all sorts of things into a budget bill that weren't necessarily that budget-minded and certainly wouldn't be done in appropriations bills. And the only reason I could think you might have left it off is it wasn't a partisan.
Or not a representational thing very much.
Well, but you've got earmarking and pork on there.
Well, I see that as being, it's a stretch, but representational because the problem, if it is one, derives from the fact of the small districts, the middle-sized district states, and the whole country is a district. It's a district heterogeneity thing that seems to generate the problem. That's the only reason.
Okay, so here's why I think it is representational. It's the balance between Congress and the president.
Well, that could be.
It gave Congress the CBO, its first independent information. So it's not partisan, but it does seem representational.
It seems to me, it doesn't seem to me, I see it, it doesn't seem to be representational. I tell you what it appears to be like. It's something like some of the stuff they were doing in the mid-40s, or the late 40s, as they were worrying about the powerful Democratic presidency. In the case of the budget reform 74, they worried, among other things, about the powerful Republican presidency, this impoundment business. In both cases, FDR and Nixon, the presidency seemed to be getting out of order as the power seemed to be accumulating in the White House. So that's a proximate cause. Both of that, then, and probably the Administrative Procedure Act, for example, in 1946, this perception of possibly growing disparateness in power. Maybe that would fit onto, maybe in that respect, for that reason, it would fit onto a list. I really don't have a clear boundary here. I must say that in this last stuff not done, I haven't tried to be clear about boundary. Yeah, you take it.
My question is about the question in your subtitle. Why doesn't the U.S. political system fly apart? Now, I wasn't able to come on Monday, so you may have gone into that great detail, but if you didn't, I'd still like to know. The title, Partisan Balance and the Corrigibility Point, would seem to be your answer, that it's just as Dahl years ago in his American Hybrid chapter in reference to democratic theory talked about a system in which long-term nagging interests, as long as they were groups that were viewed as legitimate, got some kind of attention or listened to. But if correctability is your answer, then is there what's the evidence of that?
What is
the evidence that the correctability actually does something as hyperbolic as keep the system together?
I don't have any direct evidence. It's inference.
And then what about your colleague Robert A. Dahl, who talks about overlapping cleavages, or other people who talk about consensus or some central tendency in attitudes? Aren't you really entitled this with a comparative politics politics title, and implicit research design, but also one that doesn't really. It's a great title, but doesn't relate.
Well, let me make up some counterfactuals, or rather other factuals, in circumstances where you do get dissonances in representative base in national governments, and in which pretty severe conflict or gridlock or trouble or legitimacy difficulty does arise. One would be England before the Reform Act of 1832. I mean, there's rioting in the streets, in fact, just before the people are really unhappy about that. Now, that's a kind of gerrymandering problem, cubed in England going into 1832. They could get into trouble. The problem in 1910-11 of the House of Commons versus the House of Lords, now that's an odd one, but that would bring on great legitimacy trouble to the British regime in 1910-11. It was there. I used the example last time, which probably you remember as I do, of Rhode Island in the 1930s. Remember all that? They had this coup d'etat in Rhode Island in 1935. I had some statistics about that Rhode Island, that's back in the days when Connecticut and Rhode Island had these very, very deviant one-house outliers. In Connecticut, as we remember, it was the Assembly. Rhode Island, just as egregiously, in fact, more egregiously, it was the state Senate, which represented the little towns that Providence had virtually nothing. And I had a statistic about that. And the Democrats managed to win everything except the state Senate in the Rhode Island election of 1934, which is a great Democratic year, of course, whereupon they staged a coup, brought in the cops and threw out a couple of Republicans and took over the Senate. Scrambled all the state agencies, appointed entire new Supreme Courts like Argentina within a couple of hours, and put Democrats on the court. They took over the state by coup. Now there was a legitimacy problem and a process anomaly there, which was rectified through a coup d'etat. These things can happen too. I'd say that in the American case, the national case, of the last 150 years, the most prominent deviation from was of the kind I'm talking about, involving constituencies, until the Senate, before they did the 17th Amendment, when the Senate for so long was almost constitutionally a Republican body during many, many decades. Not always, but always. And that was causing legitimacy problems, at least for the Senate. Great big ones, I think, by the first decade of the 20th century. And they fixed it. Now, there's a matter of incorrigibility. I think probably that was a bigger problem, though, than it may be a bigger problem than any of the ones I've talked about here. I'm not sure about that. I think that the district anomalies of the 30s, 40s, and 50s were pretty important. I don't have direct evidence that incorrigibility helps, but I really think it does.
I'm confused by the theory of reform that underlies your analysis. The overall theme of the series seems to be about majoritarianism, and you talked about democracy just now, and you talked at the very end of the lecture about how there isn't a lot of public support for tinkering with the Constitution. But in your analysis of the specific reforms that have succeeded or failed, you didn't emphasize the extent of public support for them. You emphasized that there was some identifiable ideological or partisan group that was getting screwed. And so I wonder, does it take that plus widespread public support?
I would think so, yeah. I would guess what it takes is parties or party-centered coalitions, or ideology, one side or the other, centered coalitions that have a lot of a talent and drive, people, scribblers, donors, as well as a case that something unfair is going on that will have resonance with a less attentive, larger public. You probably need both. But
does the public care about the filibuster or about reforming the House in the 19th?
Well, I can remember some. Yeah, I would think so. Enough out there so that you can do. But look, a lot can take place in a relatively elite sector involving. I mean, if you get 20 million people involved in something, that's not nothing.
Actually, follow a little bit, all right? I was wondering if actually another explanation might be from your second book, Congress Electoral Connection, which would be one thing that seems to be happening is that Congress allows some letting off of steam for position taking while they service the organized, right? So it's not so much partisan balance as that a lot of these issues
they get addressed by a lot of complaining and discussion. Electoral college in 2000, everybody was screaming, at least for a month or so, and then it went away. Everyone position took and disappeared. Gerrymandering is like that. It seems like campaign finance is like that. So you position take, and then you're servicing the organized who are benefiting in many of these ways from those reforms. So is that a good explanation for this instead of partisan balance?
Explanation for party imbalance?
For why we don't see more of these reforms, as opposed to partisan balance.
Well, that's going to be a part of the picture, I think. I mean, the members are going to be responding to such signals. They are. However, I do think that at the basis of these reform drives is intensity in hearing and probably millions of activists. And if you get millions of activists head up about something in the U.S. system in which they think that there's a basic unfairness going on and their side is getting traduced, then there's a lot of force in such a presentation. That's there. And politicians will respond to that, often anyway. That's what motors things, I think, basically. There's got to be a sense of a credible or a sense of unfairness that's credibly purveyable. And that will put together an activist corps that will act. And it doesn't have to involve 150 million people, but it's there. I mean, for example, take the House reform drive. The Democratic activists and informed Democratic voters all over the country, they knew about the House of Representatives in the 50s. It was not a great mystery what was going on there. The average voter didn't know who Judge Smith was. But your typical Democratic activist did know who Judge Smith was. And that was important. And it was important.
Jeff? I wonder if there may be a little bit more likelihood of some reform on electoral college and earmarking than you acknowledge. And in the electoral college case, in a perverse way, maybe according to your own logic, once one assumes that the electoral college doesn't need to be reformed through constitutional change, but might be done state by state. So, you've got Maine doing its thing, you've got Nebraska, which is really stunning, the Nebraska situation. And so if there was some sort of policy diffusion across states, individual states could actually have the kinds of incentives that you've described to generate it, to get the kind of attention that they get in campaigns that they don't get now.
Could happen. There was another plan that I think, who was it, Maryland or Colorado or somebody.
Right. There was a contingent one where their vote would change depending on the outcome of the whole thing.
It could happen. Indeed, it could. In policy diffusion, it seems to be exactly the right metaphor. It's like that could be a way of bringing about a diselecting or disempowering governors from choosing senators. That could happen state by state too. Come to think of it. Right. But in this, it could happen. But I don't see it happening. I guess I see the main Nebraska interest, as well as whatever it was in Maryland or whatever it was, interest as being a holdover from the 2000 and Gore-Bush kind of thing, and now people have forgotten about it. They're just not very interested anymore. Maybe things will uptick, but it doesn't seem to be out there. Maybe it will get out there, but it doesn't seem to be.
Well, some red states might be interested in having Obamacare about them next time. The other one, let me just mention, on earmarking and pork, both major candidates made it the centerpiece. Really the only sort of original centerpiece of their campaign. They had sort of conventional New Deal and Reagan views on substantive policy matters, and their innovations were all reformist. And Obama's getting criticized for not vetoing this bill.
Yes.
McCain wants to lead on this issue. Yeah. So there's all sorts of forces converging to suggest that there might actually be some earmark change.
I'll believe it when I see it. I really will. I'll believe it when I see it. Maybe they will. It's possible. I mean, these things do happen. And of course, you can get reform of institutions that are processes that doesn't fit into my model at all. I mean, for reasons not having to do with representational unfairness, but for if this doesn't fit there. But for other reasons, that can happen too. After all, like bringing in the Budget Bureau in 1921, that's a reform brought about by a perception that things are pretty bad in some sector, and that it could happen. I think if they do it, how do they do it? I mean, it would be, would it be a nonpartisan reform? It might be. It might be something that crosses over. It's hard. I guess it's hard to see it as a very ideologically freighted or party freighted issue if they go into it. But they could. This might be one of those areas where they tamp things down every now and then.
What's being suggested is what Keith suggested, some sort of line item.
I ask how you distinguish between public apathy.
Excuse me again, please.
How do you distinguish between public apathy and cynicism versus the public being content? Because the way I see the book, it's an anti-Wilsonian book. It's a perfect place to
Woodrow
give it.
Wilson? That Wilson?
Yeah, and you're showing that some of the problems he pointed to and others pointed to were anomalies really in the system, and that you're suggesting a lot of the system works pretty well. Obstruction isn't as bad as we think. So then we have all these periods where no one does anything about the system. So one explanation is they agree with you. In general, the system seems to be holding together. That's what, it's working. The other is the public is just apathetic or cynical, and politicians, that any change will have an effect. And so how do you build that into your story to make the argument?
I think that for anything to happen, for the public a sufficient proportion of the public has to be stirred up. They have to be stirrers. I'm back to engaged activist corps as stirrers. If you don't have them, then nothing's going to happen. And a good deal can happen without much of the public getting stirred up. I think that's true too. However, there's some political cachet sometimes in being a reformer. Sometimes the politician will reach for whatever they can get. It's like McCain. They'll reach for that. I mean, it sounds good. It is good to be a reformer. Often that's there too. But still, I think the basic answer is you need a stirrer. You need an activist corps to stir. There'll be a lot of look at the Republicans with their term limits drive in the late 80s, or the conservatives, libertarians. It's not just Republicans. It's kind of a coalition. Some stirring had to go on. I mean, most people didn't care about that after all. But then you get a powerful inspiration come down from some donors put some money behind it. There's some ads. Organizations come along, party conventions, meet and do something. And 3 years down the line, you got some force behind something. About 1980, you've written about 1988 to 92 or something. That happens. And then what? Why, then the politicians start running for office, promising that they get in, they'll do this kind of reform activity. Or in the case of the term limits, Republicans start running for office saying that not only will I vote for term limits, I commit myself to term limiting myself. That became a trope in the early 1990s. And some of them actually did, in fact, limit themselves downstream. Others didn't. They were lying, or at least they changed their minds. But all that came about. And it's there it is. It's a stir-up activity by activists, and pretty powerful stuff. I mean, it can even with most of the public apathetic or even cynical, it can be pretty powerful stuff. Actually, this is it. Did you mention Bob Dell? Who mentioned Bob Dell? Fred did. This is right out of his Who Governs book. There's most people are not stirred most of the time, but they're stirrable. Fred go? I guess he left.
No. Yeah, on that last point, it seems like what you also need is some kind of exogenous event to kind of personify the problem. So, like the term limits in the late 80s, you had the check Kylie scandal, and you had...
Yeah, which do you have the bank?
The banks.
Yes, you did. That's right.
Scandal,
yep.
Jim Wright's book.
Helps a lot.
You had a lot of these things. And so
yeah.
currently for campaign finance,
yes.
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 Other corruption cases. Do you see that generalizable through your list?
Well, now let me see.
Let
me see now. In the case of I would think it's very common. And let's see, in the case of House reform over 3 decades or so, I don't know exactly what to reach for. There might I really don't know. There might be some, actually, Julian might know, some reasonably prominent events having to do with obstruction in the House, for example, Judge Smith going back to his farm and not letting it bail out. There's a lot of press about that sort of thing sometimes. It's a kind of an event. In the case of the districting revolution, I guess I wouldn't know what to reach for. That might be more of a kind of a creep-up thing where the lawyers go to get into the courts and do it that way. But there's a lot of force behind it. It's not just a few lawyers. I mean, I remember those days, and there was an awful lot of publicity having to do with the districting problem. Books written, articles written, testimony, stuff on the Hill, stuff in the courts. It was, I'd say probably many million people were interested in it, took an interest in it. Probably that's true with that. But I can't think of an event there. In the case of Campaign for Financial Reform in 1974, I think a triggering event was Watergate, which brought out some smelly stuff having to do with Nixon's money. That was triggering. I think that's true. I suppose in the case of the 22nd Amendment, it's difficult to say. I suppose the repeated election of Roosevelt is a series of events. It's something like that. You call it.
So I was sitting here thinking about sort of another dimension of the American system that I didn't hear you talk about earlier, which is the structural federalism.
Is what again?
The structural federalism, which has really changed a lot over time.
Yeah.
The power of national versus subnational sort of policy making. And if I think about sort of from the point of view of individual voters, I would think what they care about is sort of the mix of policy they get from all of this system, right? And so I was wondering how one could think about the forces that keep that system from not flying apart as a function of the kinds of sort of reforms that you're talking about. Because there's this other whole dimension of American politics that has changed a lot over time.
Yeah.
And so part of the struggle over policy is precisely this balance between what people get from the national government and things that they get from state and local governments. And so it's hard to know exactly what the sort of median preference over those things is.
It is indeed, and I haven't thought about that. I see the importance of it as you talk, but I haven't thought about it. I wonder how we play with that. I mean, one instant thought would be that the system, this goes back to, it adverts to Julian's cynicism or apathy, that the system might have lost some legitimacy in the last 40 years in general, as the state and local governments have lost power. It's possible. That is, I've seen the same thing written about Britain by Tony King, by the way. There's a move up of power to the center in Britain over the locals. And maybe that's not good. Maybe there's a legitimacy difficulty that derives from that. It's possible. Maybe it is. It's interesting. I don't know. It's possible. I could see that. I could see maybe it is. There may be a big cost in disempowering the states and the local governments. A legitimacy cost. It's possible. Yeah, I see that. But I haven't thought about it.
Final question, Jessica.
I'm wondering why successive re-election is sometimes anti-majoritarian and other times not. So
in the sense of
presidential term limits, but not senatorial term limits.
Well, I mean, it's a matter of perception. All I'm dealing here with is perception. And I think that it's a matter of perception. And I think in the case of these two instances, that is the 22nd Amendment drive in the 40s and the what happened in the House in the 80s, there was a perception that a problem was attaching to longevity, a theoretical as well as practical problem, and therefore a remedy was needed. I haven't seen any such problem alleged or attached to Senate longevity. I just don't see it. And I think it could. I think if senators went there, I talked about this a little bit last time, if senators went there and stayed forever, like Supreme Court judges, then a problem might be voiced. But as I was saying last time, there's just astonishing volatility in the membership in the Senate, both party-wise and individual-wise. So I think it's hard to label a problem onto the Senate connected with people staying there too long. It's just hard. Everybody knows the turnover is very often immense in Senate elections. And people just don't. I think the same is true with House elections now. Since the 94 and the 06 House elections, it's a non-problem. As the longevity in the House or party control continued in the House or incumbency advantage in the House. It's not on people's blotter anymore. It's not there. I think it's a matter of perception, I think. It's not to say that people's perceptions are silly. I think in these two instances there was reality backing up the perceptions in the 40s and in the 80s. was credible. It was a credible kind of, a plausible at least kind of argument to make for the reformers. I guess the 22nd Amendment people are not often considered reformers, but I'm making them that. I think the kind of thing they were doing is similar to what other cause people have been doing.
So for the last 3 days, Professor Mayhew has gotten our lecture series off to a great start, and I appreciate it, and I hope you will help me thank him for it.
Okay.